Tem como objetivo promover a reflexão e o debate sobre temas de interesse desenvolvidos por alguns dos principais centros de investigação europeus e norte-americanos, relevantes para os meios da investigação científica e do apoio à tomada de decisão. Estamos a falar de temas tão importantes como o regresso às políticas de poder por parte das grandes potências, às alterações climáticas e o seu impacto no domínio da segurança, o futuro das relações transatlânticas e a defesa europeia. A atual conjuntura política externa tem sido caracterizada pela identificação de um conjunto de crises internas e na periferia próxima da comunidade transatlântica, desde o complexo processo negocial entre a União Europeia e o Reino Unido, no momento designado Brexit, à posição da atual administração norte-americana em relação à União Europeia e à NATO, passando pelos vários conflitos que rodeiam o espaço europeu, da Ucrânia à Síria, da Líbia ao Iémen, a conjuntura nacional, regional e internacional, a conjuntura regional e internacional apresenta uma multiplicidade de desafios e de riscos. A globalização acelerou as interdependências, mas não foi acompanhada de um reforço das instituições multilaterais para melhor responder a esses riscos e desafios. A confluência de dinâmicas contraditórias de mudança e de tensões geopolíticas múltiplas aumentam a pressão sobre a ordem internacional multilateral e tornam o contexto de segurança internacional mais complexo, volátil e incerto. Na tal conjuntura, assistimos a uma ordem internacional instável, ao recrudescimento das tensões geopolíticas e geoeconómicas entre as grandes potências e a uma significativa perturbação no sistema de alianças e também nas organizações internacionais que nos habituamos a ver regular a vida internacional, como, por exemplo, o Fundo Monetário Internacional, o Banco Mundial, a Organização Mundial do Comércio e até mesmo nas conferências que tentam regular problemas de governação mundial, como sejam as conferências sobre o clima. Como dizia o Dr. Jaime Gama, numa recente conferência em Faro, todo este sistema tem vindo a ser desafiado e encontra-se fragilizado. O sistema das Nações Unidas não desempenha hoje sequer 30% das funções que era suposto desempenhar quando foi criado e quando se desenvolveu. E é neste contexto de erosão da arquitetura internacional que assistimos ao regresso às políticas de poder das grandes potências e à emergência de novos poderes ascendentes que cada um, à sua maneira, procura recuperar espaço internacional ou ampliar esferas de influência, tirando partido de uma ordem internacional fragilizada ou anárquica. Como é bom de ver, temos aqui um amplo leque de questões que suscitam um estimulante debate e que seguramente não se esgotarão numa manhã. Estou certo que nesta sessão teremos um conjunto de intervenções e testemunhos de grande qualidade e um debate sem dúvida estimulante, para o qual contamos, como sempre, com a presença e participação dos nossos convidados. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the seminar aims at presenting the state of affairs on both politics and academic research on four main topics of current international agenda: power politics, the global impact of climate change on security, the present and future developments of transatlantic relationship, and European defence project. In the 21st century, international relations are characterized by a simultaneous return of great powers politics and regionalization of international affairs. Both place a challenge and a strain to the way international actors relate to great powers and international organizations. This, not to mention the fact that bilateral interests and policy preference today compete openly with multilateral fora of cooperation in the way security matters are dealt with, such as hybrid warfare, cyber threats, terrorism, organized crime, climate change, irregular migration, internal security and defense. For reasons of scope and time, the seminar could not cover all these important topics, a reason for which we have selected one main theme with a truly global impact, such as the link between climate change and security risks, and two of the most successful and enduring cooperative multilateral projects like NATO and the European Union. Climate factors, when combined with consequences of demographic pressure, hyper-urbanization, resources depletion, the impact of war on habitats and traditional ways of living of communities, often lead to irregular movements of communities with political, social, and economic impact across countries and regions. In fact, climate change can act as a threat multiplier on other traditional security issues and has already become a matter of national interest and national security. Climate change presents indeed a significant threat to global security and stability. New security and defense shifts and challenges in regional and international politics have been posing a strain on alliances and multilateral security and defense, but they also offer an opportunity to strive for better cooperation, more adequate institutions, and effective operational output in security and defense. In the transatlantic context, NATO is successfully adapting to the impact of asymmetrical and hybrid warfare, terrorism and cyber threats, remaining a core framework for allies' defense doctrines, capabilities development, and deterrence of military threats. Similarly, the European Union, with its comprehensive approach to external crises, is focusing on prevention, ownership, and resilience of states and communities to the political, economic, and societal effects of insecurity, being a cornerstone for cooperative security of its member states. Also, in the domain of research, industrial innovation, and capabilities development, the European Union has set conditions to support its civilian and military operational commitments. By sharing the same values and interests, NATO and the European Union are working and cooperating jointly to address the common challenges and threats allies and partners face in contemporary world, complementing each other without giving away the very reason of their foundation, the transatlantic community defense and the peace in Europe. All these topics, together with others of similar importance, will sure be on our agenda today. For this reason, this seminar will count with the contribution of a qualified group of speakers and moderators, all of them distinguished specialists on the topics under discussion, who will greatly enrich today's session. I would like to conclude expressing my most sincere appreciation to all speakers and moderators for the kind acceptance of our invitation and sharing with us their insights on such interesting topics. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção.
The president of the Luso-American Development Foundation, Rita Faden, will address the audience.
Muito obrigada. Queria, em primeiro lugar, cumprimentar o Sr. Presidente do Instituto de Defesa Nacional, General Viana, e cumprimentar também todos os presentes aqui ou por videoconferência. A FLAD e o IDN têm uma longa parceria estratégica para debater assuntos de segurança e defesa, e é uma parceria da qual nós nos orgulhamos particularmente e à qual queremos dar continuidade. Este seminário é um exemplo dessa parceria, que tem sido um sucesso ao longo destes últimos anos. It is an honor for me to be here and to have such distinguished guests. If I can present FLAD, the organization where I'm from, FLAD is a private Portuguese foundation that has a very specific aim, because our goal and our mission is to contribute to the development of Portugal through the bilateral cooperation with the United States of America. And we focus on 4 main areas: education, science, culture, and transatlantic relations. As such, the seminar that we have here today and the topics that we are going to discuss, and on my case that we are going to hear today, are of great interest for us. When I was preparing this conference and I was reading the program and reading your CVs, I thought that I wanted also to compliment the organizers of the conference, because we have such a broad issue, thinking today's world. It's a very broad and ambitious team, and it's very difficult to try to understand which of the subjects would be more interest to and of more relevance to include in this very broad subject. But I think you have managed at EDN to pinpoint some of the most specific and most interesting perspectives and challenges, and that is something that I am very much interested to hear this seminar today and to learn from you, because I believe that one of the things that we will try to do here also, it's the intersection of climate change with security and development. It's something that I find very interesting, but at the same time we will discuss the transatlantic relations and also the return of the great powers. So we will discuss also real international relations and geostrategic issues which are of great relevance to us. So my hope is that this will be a thought-provoking debate, and in the end we will have enriched ourselves and have enriched the debate through these subjects that we'll be discussing here today. So without further ado, I would just say that I'm very looking forward to hear from you, and I want to thank EDN for this cooperation. Thank you very much.
Now we invite Professor Sven Biskup and Professor Isabel Nunes to take their seats.
Muito bom dia a todos os nossos convidados aqui em Lisboa, também a quem nos acompanha a partir do Funchal e da delegação do Instituto de Defesa Nacional no Porto. Agora vamos mudar de língua de trabalho. So this seminar entitled Thinking Today's World gathers, as the previous introductions have stated, several issues which are extremely relevant, especially if we think about the general tendency to renationalize foreign policy and subsequently to renationalize defense and also security. And of course this is to a certain extent at odds not only with the scale of the international challenges we face, but also with the helping us to think how to draft better policies on how to meet these challenges. We have invited 3 excellent speakers. Unfortunately, Jeremy Shapiro was not able to be with us. We won't be able to be with us this morning. But we have asked Sven Biskup, who kindly accepted our challenge, to address both topics, so the return of great power politics and also European defense and the defense of Europe. Inside your folders you can find the program as it will happen. It's on a loosened sheet, and also the biographic notes of the speakers, so I will introduce them very briefly because you are here to hear them, not to hear me. So I will start with Sven Biskup. He's the director of the Europe in the World program of the renowned Institute Egmont, which is based in Brussels. Sven Biskup, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, for visiting us once again. He's a regular visitor to our institute, and it's always a pleasure to hear him. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel. A warm thanks indeed for asking me back. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Lisbon. I have a feeling the day will come when I will know everybody in the audience, which will of course make it even more fun to always come. Thanks also for the flexibility, because though I didn't cancel, I did also had to rearrange my travel a bit, and thank you for accommodating that. I have a very large brief to look at grand strategy, at geopolitical environment, the EU's role in it, and then also specifically the part of European defense potentially. And I want to cover that in three parts. One, to say something about how I interpret the current global environment in which we have to operate. Secondly, discussing how I see a potential European grand strategy developing. And then thirdly, going into European defense. And of course, I'll leave plenty of time for debate, which is always supposed to be the most interesting. There is never enough time, of course, but luckily for you, I've also written it all down in my latest book, flyers for which are available outside, but don't worry, I didn't bring any copies, so nobody will force you to buy anything. But as I always say, you know, we all arrive in a situation where sometimes you feel obliged to give a gift to someone whom you don't really like. Well, this is the perfect item then to present it to them. So first, the global environment. I think General Viana already mentioned his introduction. We're back in an era of great power rivalry. In a way that should not surprise us, because if you look at the history of world politics, that's normality. We're usually in an era of great power rivalry. We're just not used to it anymore, because, of course, since after the Second World War, we got a Cold War and a bipolar system. And then, I guess for a decade or so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we thought that all of this was behind us. And certainly I think we in Europe sort of began to think that power politics didn't matter anymore, that geopolitics didn't matter, and that everybody was becoming nice and polite company, just like ourselves. And then we realized with a shock that while we decided to look away, geopolitics, of course, never went anywhere, right? I know people like to talk about the return of geopolitics, but you know, geopolitics is like the weather; it's always there. You may decide not to think about it and go out without an umbrella, and then certainly in Brussels the risk is that you're getting wet. And it's the same with geopolitics. You may decide not to think about it, and then suddenly you realize that it has sneaked up on you, and that you have to get your act together. So we're back into great power rivalry. We're back into a multipolar world. I would say today there are 3 great powers and maybe 4. There's of course the United States, the most powerful of the great powers. There is China, which is again a great power, and there is Russia, which is sort of clinging to its great power status, even though it has lost a lot of power since the end of the Cold War. And then there is ourselves, who don't really know whether we want to be a power. So probably we aren't really one, because if you doubt, then you aren't maybe, but we could be, and I will argue that we should be. And I think these 4, they are competing, but they are also still cooperating. And the defining question for the coming decades, I think, would be those 4, how will they interact? Because the result of their interaction will determine whether we'll have peace and stability or war and conflict. That is not to belittle other issues. I mean, certainly for Europe there's also the question of our unstable neighborhoods, specifically to the south. Certainly there's the overall global challenge of climate change. But if we want to solve climate change, it's also, I think, quite important that we don't kill each other while we're looking for how to mitigate the consequences of climate change. There is one novelty, though, in this multipolar environment, and I think that is the change in US grand strategy. And I'm sure my colleague Stephen Brooks will talk more about it and will possibly contradict me, but I will put forward my case. I think for the first time since the Second World War, Europe is no longer the primary theater of focus for American strategy. During the war, once the US entered the war, after it was attacked by Japan, then the UK and the US sat together and they decided on the grand strategy, which could be summarized in 2 words: Germany first. Japan could be contained, but the war had to be won in Europe first, and then Japan could be addressed. And then during the Cold War, Europe was also the primary theater, even though the war turned hot everywhere but Europe, but the point was Europe, and you could say even the point was, the inner German border, and in the end, Berlin. But today, if President Trump says Germany first, it's because Germany is first on his hit list. Not because Germany is his primary area of focus. It seems today that for the US strategic community, the area of focus is China. China is seen as the only potential peer competitor that seems to be cutting across party lines. So my feeling is that whoever wins the presidential elections next year, this will not change, and there will be a much more confrontational attitude towards China than we have in Europe. And that competition with China will play out first and foremost in Asia. And so Europe then becomes a secondary theater, which is still important because, of course, if you want to compete with China, then having Europe on your side will help you get out on top in this competition. But it does mean, I think, that Europe is seen in a more instrumental fashion rather than as a goal in its own right. Now, if you look at history, I think one can derive some guidelines on how to deal with the situation of multipolarity. I know that one has to be careful with historical examples because history is long and complicated, and so whichever point you want to make, you can always find one example that suits your case. Perhaps one universally valid lesson of history is that nothing is inevitable. And I want to stress that because very often today things are presented as if they are inevitable, right? How many times don't you read that there will be a war between the US and China? And I'm thinking, well, no. People always have to make choices. People and governments have to make choices, and nothing is inevitable per se, which is all the more reason why we have to think carefully about our strategy. If I look at the history of great power relations, I just want to briefly highlight 4 guidelines that I think can help us identify a correct European strategy. 1, if you want to create a stable world order, you cannot do that if you create a system whose aim is to keep one of the great powers of the day outside of the system, right? Because then the power that you want to push outside the system will, of course, push back and will try to undermine your system. Very concretely, if today you want to create a rules-based stable order against China, that will not work. It will only work if you include China and, of course, also Russia in it. Second guideline, the fact that you want to have all of the great powers on board does not mean, however, that you need to accept everything that they do. Because another lesson from history is that if nothing happens when the rules of the rules-based order are broken, then the rules will be hollowed out and eventually the order will collapse. So there are red lines to be drawn, and when red lines are crossed, action must be taken. But we must also be careful about where we draw the red lines. I had the pleasure and the opportunity just last weekend to attend the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And of course, one of the main issues there is Chinese claims to the South China Sea. And for sure, China has crossed the red line because even though it has not conquered any territory by force of arms, there have been no combat operations, but China has has created bases and is permanently stationing troops on islands and artificial features outside its own territory. So that is territorial expansion, that is a red line. And everybody will have to decide how to react against that. And some powers may decide to also use economic instruments to react against that. But one should also be careful. If one pushes the economic measures too far, one creates the impression that the economic rise of China in itself is also crossing a red line. And then I think that is going too far, because if you say that China cannot grow economically, if you aim to prevent that, then you're set on a collision course that will lead to conflict. At the same time, this is a balancing act also for China itself. I think great powers usually are good at compartmentalizing, meaning they can agree on one dossier while they compete in another one. Even with Russia, we can still do this. We have a very serious dispute with Russia because of Ukraine, yet trade with Russia continues, especially in energy. I think with China, this is still more difficult. I think China has still difficulty in accepting that we may reject our policies in one area, and we may take countermeasures without that meaning that we necessarily see them as an overall enemy. So that's also a balancing act. Third guideline, if we want other powers to play by the rules, well, we have to play by the rules ourselves. And I think that is particularly difficult today because of the United States' stance on multilateralism. If we as the EU speak with the Chinese today and say, look, there's a couple of WTO guidelines and rules that you really should apply, then the Chinese say, yeah, but isn't it the US that is blocking the WTO today? Those are your friends, right? So surely that must be very easy to solve. So why don't you deal with that first, and then when that's settled, come back and talk to us. And then what do you say as the Europeans? Can't talk. Final guideline, in the end, no country wants to be dominated by another country. It seems evident, but I want to stress it because we seem to forget that. Today, a lot of countries are targeted by China's Belt and Road Initiative and or by Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. But with a few exceptions, there are exceptions, but very few, the other countries, they don't want to be exclusively dominated by either China or Russia. They want to profit from what China and Russia have to offer, but they also want to maintain deep economic relationships with the United States and with Europe. So this is not a Cold War. When a country joins the Belt and Road Initiative, it does not disappear behind an iron curtain and become inaccessible to us, which is good because the EU member states have signed memoranda with the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Most recently, Italy, unfortunately, with very bad timing just before the EU-China summit. This is also not an ideological confrontation. I would say that China has no ideology. There's a facade, but behind that, just the regime is in power and wants to stay in power. That's basically it. China is not seeking to export any model. China is just pursuing its interest and is seeking economic benefit very, very pragmatically. So we should not turn this into an ideological confrontation because, again, that locks you into a logic of conflict, which we shouldn't do while this is still avoidable. So if you take all of this together and move to my second point, how then can Europe act in this multipolar environment? And I see a strategy emerging already at three levels. One, towards the other great powers. Two, towards the other countries, so the non-great powers. And three, in Europe itself. So, towards the other great powers, I take some inspiration from Bismarck. Now, that might seem a bit counterintuitive to go back to Bismarck because he did provoke a series of wars in order to unify Germany into an empire. But we have a European Union already, so we can safely skip that part, and we can go to Bismarck the Elder, who once the empire was established, created a network of alliances in order to make sure that he had better relations with each of the great powers of the day than the other great powers had among themselves, so as to avoid the emergence of an anti-German coalition. And that system worked perfectly fine, until Wilhelm II ascended the throne, decided that he knew everything better, and fired Bismarck. I think it's Kissinger who wrote that you don't really have a Bismarckian system if the system is dependent on the presence of a genius like Bismarck. And if you look at recent elections, we all know that our democracies are not always capable of producing a genius when you need one, right? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But anyway, I think the point I want to make is that for me, this is the strategy that the EU should follow. It is not in our interest, I think, to provoke a new bipolarity, we and the Americans against the Chinese and the Russians, because we would once again be stuck in an eternal logic of conflict and confrontation that would be very difficult to get out of. and it would not be beneficial to our economic interest. China today is not the Soviet Union of the late 40s and early 50s. The Soviet Union could have been on Mars, so to say, because it was an entirely different economic world. But China today is totally interwoven with our economy, so you can't just cut yourself loose from China. Furthermore, China has a lot more power now, economic power, than the Soviet Union used to have. So if we go for a bipolar confrontation, and once again we try to force every other country on earth to choose sides, then we might be surprised that quite a few would end up choosing China, given the proximity, but also given the economic clout of China. And finally, China is not today's Russia. As I said, China is not ideological. I think the Russians are sort of stuck in an ideological strategy of confrontation and a quest for status. And it seems to me that they're more opportunistic than strategic, Whenever they see a chance to irritate, especially the US, they will do it. You never know what it's good for, even though there's a price to be paid. Whereas China very pragmatically pursues its interest, and that means that you can reason with it. If it's interest-based, you can reason with it. If it's based on ideology, then it becomes more difficult. So I would say, of course, of the current great powers, we will be much closer always to the United States than to the other two, but that doesn't mean that the other two are ipso facto the enemy. I would say the EU position should be one of engagement. We should be the power that can work with all of the other great powers. So my bumper sticker for our strategy would be cooperate where you can, push back when you must, vis-à-vis China and Russia. But don't proclaim them the enemy unless they are. This is, of course, dependent also on China's behavior, right? If China would set out to start conquering other countries, that strategy would, of course, have to be changed. But I think that is highly unlikely. So again, this does not mean that we should become apologists for China. Right? I mean, as I always say, is my ultimate argument. My husband is Taiwanese, so there's bits of Chinese strategy that I wholeheartedly disagree with. But we also should not think that because China is foreign, because China is not democratic, that therefore it must be our enemy. Historically speaking, there is no rule that says that only other democracies can be your partners and allies, right? Let's not forget that during the war, Second World War, we allied with the USSR, which was quite an authoritarian system. Let's not forget that during the Cold War, even though post factum we presented it as the struggle of democracy against communism, that in reality we supported quite a few authoritarian regimes as long as they were not communist. And so today I think we should work with all of the great powers when that is in our interest. And to put it very bluntly, the internal political conditions in China are not a vital interest of Europe. Our vital interest is that China behaves according to the rules in its relations with other states. So what we need is not necessarily a liberal world order. What we need is a rules-based order. An order in which every state in its dealings with other states behaves according to the rules. That some of those states are massive human rights violators inside their own countries is very deplorable, and it does concern us, and we should continue to speak out about it, but that is not our vital interest. The liberal world order, understood as the idea that one should try to make democracies out of every country, I'm afraid is an idea that we have to abandon, because we are just not capable of doing that. We are creating false expectations, and we're creating ourselves. That does not mean that we should abandon human rights. We should maintain a critical human rights dialogue with everybody, including with China, because human rights are universal. Otherwise, they wouldn't be called human rights, but European rights, or Belgian rights, or Flemish rights versus Wallonian rights, if you carry on. So that's sort of my view on relations with China and Russia. Push back where you must, but cooperate where you can. That's my default position. Now, towards the other countries, the non-great powers. Many of us in Europe have, of course, been colonial powers, right? We have had colonies, protectorates, we have dominated the world. Nobody feels any nostalgia for that, well, except Boris Johnson, of course, and a few of them. So our objective is not to dominate anybody, right? I think what is our interest is that countries that matter to us that they are not dominated against their will by one of the other powers. That is what we should seek to avoid. So I think our strategy towards the other countries should be one aimed at strengthening their sovereignty. And I do think that we have a lot of leeway to play here. As I said, many countries are targeted by the Belt and Road Initiative and or by the Eurasian Economic Union. And what we should do, I think, and that's the strategy that is emerging if you read the EU's connectivity strategy for Asia, is to say to these countries, look, we are of course not going to tell you that you cannot trade with China or that China cannot invest in your country, because we trade with China, right? What we want to say is that we think that it's in your interest that in addition to your relationship with China, you also develop a deep trade and investment relationship with us and with the US, so as to avoid that you become dominated by China alone or by Russia alone. Because when that happens, you will be sucked totally into China's orbit and you will lose your sovereignty. So what we propose is that you maintain, that's the only precondition, you have to maintain an open and transparent economic system and apply the rules of the international economic game, and then you can also deal with us, and that would be in everybody's interest. So you cannot make this conditional upon democratization, because then many of these countries are going to say no. Then they're not going to do it. But you can make it conditional upon transparency and an open economic system. And that is the line as I see it developing in the connectivity strategy for Asia, but it's a strategy that I think the EU can apply worldwide. And we have the resources and the instruments to do that. Creating FTAs with the important players is an important instrument in this regard. You know, countries like Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, they all want to maintain a degree of equidistance. And an FTA with the EU, which all of those now have, is an anchor. You know, an anchor that avoids them from being sucked entirely into China's orbit. So these FTAs have important strategic effects also. Finally then is Europe itself. Sometimes when I give this presentation, people sort of feel that I'm just giving in to China and Russia, and they think that I just sort of abdicate. And you could say, well, you know, if you're a Belgian dealing with strategy, one of the things you need to know is to know when to surrender, you know, historically speaking. But this is not about surrender or abdication. This is not a strategy that you can pursue from a position of weakness. You can only engage powers the size of Russia and China or the US from a position of strength, right? If from a position of weakness you say to China, let's cooperate, then of course they will swamp you and they will call the shots. So you can only engage them from a position of strength. And that requires political and economic unity, which of course for the moment we don't have. The EU is aware of this and important steps have been taken. Think of the investment screening mechanism now that obliges member states to report foreign attempts at investment in critical sectors to the EU, and the Commission can then propose an advice, but in the end it remains a national decision whether or not to allow the investment. This is a first step. It allows those countries who want to limit foreign ownership in critical sectors to do that by referring to the EU, but I feel we should go further here and create a uniform and binding EU regime, because we should not be naive, and we should make sure that in critical sectors there is no foreign ownership, or there is a ceiling on foreign ownership. And foreign for me simply means non-European, so it's not just an anti-China policy, it means non-European. But at the same time, of course, we should be, discerning enough and really apply this only in sectors that truly have a link to national security, right? If China buys a chain of flower shops, I don't care. If China wants to buy my national electricity grid, I care, so to say. But the problem is, as you all know, that we are not so politically and economically unified for the moment. And so the strategy that I'm proposing, you could say in a way is just science fiction. Now, I like science fiction, I read a lot of science fiction, so nothing against that, but then maybe they should put my book in a different section in the bookshop. Perhaps actually some people would buy it. We're in the science fiction section, I'm not sure. That's another debate. Because, to put it again very bluntly, we have traitors in our midst, right? Every meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU, there's one or two or more member states who basically are in the pocket of China or Russia or both, and who willingly act as agents of foreign powers to slow down or to paralyze EU decision making. And that is very short-sighted on the part of those governments who do that. It may serve their short-term interests, but in the long term, it is killing their own interests as well, because it destroys the EU's negotiating position, and in the end, these countries will suffer too. And they should not forget that in the end, all of us are highly dependent on the single market. And for those who are in it, on the Eurozone. So you cannot separate the national economic interest of one EU member state in the end from that of the other EU member states. One way out of this would of course be to go towards majority voting in EU foreign policy. That is on the table, though we cannot introduce this on everything in one big bang, but I do think progress will be made, but we should go faster. Now, third and final point, in this strategy, what is the role of military power for the EU? And EU thinking has evolved. It has become a lot more realpolitik, if you want. We know that it's about interest, and we know also as EU that if you want to be a power, you have to be a power in all three dimensions: political, economic, and military. And important initiatives have been taken. Permanent structured cooperation has been launched. The Commission has created the European Defence Fund. And these initiatives are qualitatively different from everything that went before. Because one, they have been institutionalized, right? They're legally binding, but okay, I'm a Belgian. There's lots of stuff that's legally binding. I still don't do it. But it has been institutionalized, so it means it will not disappear. Most of the other attempts that we've had, both in the EU and in NATO, to promote European defence cooperation were in the end informal gentlemen's agreements. And at one point they always fizzled out, and then the day would always come and you would open the website, and let's say the NATO website, and suddenly you think, that's strange, smart defence has just disappeared, from the rhetoric. Or on the EU side, pooling and sharing, it's just gone. But today, PESCO will not go away because it's now part of the legal and institutional framework, just like the NATO defense planning process. Right? The NDPP doesn't guarantee that actually all states meet their targets. Most of them don't. But it does mean that once a year at least, they will have to sit through a moment of shame to explain them to the others why they haven't met their targets. And that will be the same on the EU side. The other thing that is qualitatively different is that the Commission has now become a key driver of the European defence debate. And there is now money on the EU budget for defence. That's of course also member states' money. The EU is funded by the member states, but it is a form of common funding for defence. It's very interesting because everybody always resisted that. In NATO and in the EU, nobody ever wanted common funding in defence, and suddenly it's there. 1.5 billion a year. It's a fortune compared to my salary, of course, or to our institute's budget. It's not a fortune if you compare it to the total defense spending of the EU 28, but it's a first step, and if you use that money smartly, you can use it to orient the decision-making of the member states. And it's important also that the Commission is now a driver, because once the Commission machine gets going, it doesn't stop. Whereas member states' commitment is fickle, and you already see that. And that's the point I want to make. PESCO started everything went very fast. Germany and France took the initiative, then brought on board Spain and Italy, and then 4 more. And they announced it in July 17, their intention to activate PESCO, and in December 17 it was already a fact. Everything moved enormously quickly, but I have the feeling that now we're at risk of sort of slowing down and getting bogged down in discussions about procedures and third country participation. And now it's more about the rules than about what is it actually for. And you can already feel that Germany has lost a lot of interest, apparently, not very active. France is France. Don't need to explain that, I suppose. So they have also launched their own initiative, the European Intervention Initiative. They focus on the defence industrial bit and on kicking out the UK. But where are the key strategic projects, right? We have a list of 34 PESCO projects. Most of them are not very important. None of them are useless. But most of them will not really change the strategic picture. The only exception, I think, is the male drone project, but that already predated PESCO. So the point of PESCO is not to add 10 or 12 projects every year. The point is to now launch the really key strategic projects that we need to achieve strategic autonomy, the project that we wouldn't have without PESCO. And then I've spoken the word strategic autonomy is now one of the buzzwords in Brussels and one of the really contentious concepts in the transatlantic relationship also. A letter was written by the United States to Mogherini, the High Representative, but signed not by the Secretary of Defense but by one of the deputies, which was of course a bit of a slight, in which the US basically said that the way PESCO and the European Defence Fund are now conceived, that these are poison pills. That word was used for the transatlantic relationship. Well, that ruffled quite a few feathers in Brussels. The EU sent a sober reply saying, well, this is what we are doing, this is why we're doing it, and we're going to continue doing it. And my advice would indeed be to do just that, to just frankly ignore the US and just do it, if we are serious about it, right? If we're serious about it and we really want to do PESCO and we really want to achieve strategic autonomy, then we should ignore these American complaints and do it, and then the results will speak for themselves. However, if we're not serious about it and if we're doubting, do we really want it, then we should think twice, because you don't want to upset the US for something that actually you're not going to do. So we have to think very carefully here, what is it that we are doing? My position is clear. Of course we need strategic autonomy. And the idea that strategic autonomy for the EU undermines NATO, in my view, is just silly. I mean, the US has strategic autonomy. Obviously, it's a member of NATO. Nobody ever asks you, does US strategic autonomy undermine NATO? Well, of course not. The point is, on the European side, the individual states no longer have strategic autonomy, or it's extremely limited. So the individual European governments have already lost strategic autonomy, but we could still regain it by pooling our defense efforts via the EU and build the type of capability that we need. But this requires that on both sides, EU and NATO, we get over some taboos. NATO should realize that actually, in many capability areas, there's no point in setting national targets for individual European countries, because they will never make a major contribution. They have become too small, no? What's the point of setting for Belgium a target in strategic air transport, you know? How much capacity are we ever going to get? NATO should realize that in many areas the Europeans can only make a major effort collectively, and maybe they should introduce into the NATO defense planning process an in-between level that looks at the European allies and partners that also make up the EU, partially Cyprus, to set them collective targets. And so NATO should, I think, accept that for many Europeans the best way of meeting their capability targets is to use the EU mechanisms of PESCO and the EDF. Vice versa, the EU should be fully aware that the point of PESCO is not only to create capabilities for CSDP operations, because let's be honest, the CSDP military operations until now have been very limited. They cover only a tiny bit of the spectrum, and most of the bigger and certainly combat operations that we have done on a national basis or in ad hoc coalitions of the willing. So the point of PESCO should be to become the one-stop shop where Europeans collectively develop all of the capabilities, look at the entirety of their armed forces that they need to meet all of their targets for NATO, for the EU, and their national targets. Then you can really maximize PESCO, create maximal effects of scale, and create maximum synergies. And the final question, and of course that will be my final point also, is, well, strategic autonomy, what for though? What do you want to do in an autonomous fashion? And here I think is actually the gap in our thinking. Even those who are strongly in favor of it don't readily identify what it is that we want to do. And I would say, again, there are three levels. One is what in American terms one would call homeland security. So to protect Europe's borders, to protect our cyberspace, to protect our data, to protect ourselves against terrorism. Nobody doubts that we do this already in a strategically autonomous way. I think here the challenge is probably just, especially to make sure that individual member states cooperate more than they do, and that maybe some of this has to happen at the EU level. also. Secondly, expeditionary operations. In a way, the notion, or to say the term strategic autonomy is new, but actually nothing is new, because the point of the creation of the Common Security and Defense Policy back in 98-99 was exactly that, to allow the Europeans to do expeditionary operations outside Europe without the Americans. So I don't understand why the US is now so upset about it. Well, I do understand, because there's a big fear that we will buy more European equipment than American equipment, but actually, apart from that, nothing is really new. So I think that should be the priority focus of the strategic autonomy debate, to finally allow us to meet the good old Helsinki headline goal of 1999. It's 20 years old now. It's about time that we meet it, I would say, to be able to deploy and sustain up to an army corps for expeditionary operations in our broad neighborhood. But we should be clear what that means. Up to an army corps means not just a host of small operations that together add up to big numbers. It means that you also need a capacity, if necessary, to do one really big operation, which requires a lot more in terms of command and control, ISTAR, transport, and so on and so forth. So we need the strategic enablers to be able to do that. And everybody knows that if you want to have the troops amounted to an army corps deployed, you actually need 3 army corps, right? One that's deployed, one that is ready to be deployed, and one that has been deployed. So it's actually not 60,000, it's at least 3 times that number. That is ambitious, but we should be able to do that as Europeans. And then finally, the third level is, what about collective territorial defense? And here too, we should probably think about this, because if the US focus is on Asia, what happens in a scenario in which US attention is absorbed by a crisis in Asia? Do we feel confident in Europe that European conventional forces alone are sufficient to deter any aggression, or if deterrents fail, to defend against it, right? To put it in different terms, what's the scenario that we're thinking about if the Americans cannot immediately come to our help in a crisis? Do we prepare for occupation and we wait 4 years to be, for the landing in Normandy? Is that the scenario? Not so appealing. Or do we think that we should be able to hold out longer? Or is this just a useless hypothetical scenario because nobody is capable of aggressing EU, NATO, even if the United States were temporarily absorbed by a crisis in Asia? But I think it's a debate that should be on the table. So to conclude, I do think that actually a lot is going on in EU-Europe, that elements of a grand strategy are falling into place, and I think now is the time to sort of think those through and to collate them all together and make sure that everybody, that everybody sees the big picture. We have pieces of the puzzle, but everybody must make sure that, when you buy a puzzle, there's the picture on the top of the box, right, that tells you where you should arrive at. Everybody should be clear that they have the same picture, because you also have these children's puzzles, right, where every side is another picture. Then, of course, it doesn't fit. So we will soon, hopefully, soon know who will be the new High Representative, President of the Commission, President of the Council. Probably sooner than we will know who will be the next Belgian Prime Minister. But that's not a reference, because we might take a year or so, unfortunately. So I think we need now to use this opportunity to revisit the EU global strategy. Not because it's a bad document, but because it's a good document. And precisely because it's good, we have to make sure that we continue implementing it. So we have to think it through, refine it where it needs to be refined, and make sure that all of these elements that we are developing, from the connectivity strategy to the investment screening mechanism to PESCO and the EDF, that we know exactly where they fit in the big strategic picture. I hope 2 things. One, that the IDN will invite me on the next occasion, and 2, that on that occasion I will be able to report major progress on all of this. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sven. So we would open a period of debate in Lisbon, also in Oporto and in Funchal. I would ask our guests in Oporto to raise their name tags, which are in front of them. It helps to moderate. And in Madeira, I would ask them to raise their hands, if you please. So we already have one question. À direita.
António Duarte, I came from IDN. My English not very good, so I will try to understand, please. Try if you understand. I usually listen about the threat of China or the risk of China and Russia, but in the last 2 years, I think that the main problem came not from Russia, for Europe, not from Russia or from China. I think they are, for Europe, don't are really great threats, even Russia. But I think the main Russia is the United States, because is what we have to be afraid, I think, is to be dominated by the United States. They want to that we pay the air spent in armaments, and they use Europe. So what I want to ask you is what you think about the United States and now a new administration. I think they are very positive today, and I don't know if we don't have to be careful also with the United States as a great power. I think the main threat, but main risk to Europe, to the formation of Europe, is the United States today.
We have another question here in the first row. Primeira fila, por favor. Doutora Rita Faden.
Thank you so much. I would say that I have a slightly different opinion and question from the last one. Thank you for your intervention. I really thought it was interesting and that you have, how can I say it, a refreshing, engaging European perspective, but at the same time with a touch of real politics. So it's a mix of European engagement with the real politics, I would say. My question has to do when you were speaking about how we should engage with the great powers. You said that Europe should engage equally with, if I understood correctly, equally with all of them. Apparently saying that we should not privilege the relations with the United States as we have had for the past decades. I mean, since the end of Second World War, we have the transatlantic relations and all the creation of the multi-international order that has governed the relations between Europe and the United States over the last decades. And from what I gather, you say that we should move from that preferential relationship and should engage with all great powers on a similar way? That is one question. For instance, in Portugal, the Foreign Affairs Ministry has stated that Portugal, we are allies of the United States, but we are partners with China. So we are making a difference in the way that we engage with the different powers. So I would like you to comment on this. Thank you.
Vamos passar então ao Porto, por favor. Podia colocar a sua questão, o seu comentário.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you, nowadays the USA is antagonizing almost all of its allies, including the European Union. So, do you think that is it possible that in the future the European Union will be drawn into China and Russia's sphere of power, even if it's for economic reasons, and maybe in the future we'll have the integration of what we can call Eurasia? Or if the European Union chooses to stick with the United States, it will risk being just isolated. Because the fact is that nowadays, considering that the international trade is slowing down, which means that probably we'll have an economic crisis, what are our chances? Thank you so much.
Muito obrigada. Well, if you will be able to be very, very brief, because Sven Biskup unfortunately will not be able to stay with us until the end of this seminar, so we have to do a very good time management. So we have two questions, one in the middle, Liliana, this lady here in the middle, and then on the last row.
My question is quite brief. We've talked about geopolitics, but we haven't talked about the question of national sovereignty. how do we get these governments from member states to sell to their own members of government the investment of a common European defence without disrespecting their own national sovereignty?
Last row, please. Do lado direito.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Patricia Dienhardt, Portuguese Institute of International Relations. I would like to ask you, and going back to Bismarck and trying to be very brief, the idea of setting up a network of alliances was to avoid the emergence of a counter-balancing alliance or country, but basically it was also Germany's aim to isolate France. And sometimes I wonder, I think it was an effective strategy also because it only lasted for 20 years. In the long term, I think it's very difficult to manage such a broad strategy, but that's just a comment. But regarding the EU's relationship and a bit also what other people have said, are you suggesting a sort of not equidistance, but you're saying that maybe we should look at US, China and Russia more or less at the same time, whereas I would argue that the transatlantic security community, we should at the same time try to see it as our main focus, even if we're not looking at democratization, but to ensure a rules-based order. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for all those questions. All of this is quite related, so let me try to pull it all together. I wouldn't say that the US is a main threat to us, of course, but it is clear that current. But I think you have to distinguish between what are longer-term trends and what is peculiar to the current US administration. There are two things. I would say the fact that we're in a multipolar world and the fact that US strategy is focusing on China, that is a longer-term structural thing, and it was Obama who introduced the so-called pivot to Asia, and so I would say whoever wins the race for the White House next year, that's not going to change. You know that U.S. perception of the world is not going to change, and so we will always have to find a way to manage that. For example, in NATO, because I think for the Europeans, the point of NATO is still to deter Russia. But now you see that the United States is trying to put China on the agenda of NATO. I think that's a very bad idea. And you can see here that there's a potential divergence, and I don't think we'll be able to avoid the divergence because we see the world differently, but the question is how do you manage it? And of course it's more difficult to manage with a president who acts like Trump acts, right? So some things are peculiar to this administration, and it seems to me in particular also the dislike of multilateral frameworks. I would hope that a next president would once again try to use multilateralism to further the US interest, because then we can work with that rather than seeing multilateralism as a threat to the US interest. If, however, Trump is re-elected, or Ivanka Trump is elected, I don't know whether that's possible, or a Trumpist, let's say, is elected, and we get another 4 years of sort of undermining multilateralism, then this would become difficult, ever more difficult to manage for Europe. So it's a question of dealing with the long-term trends, and then it's not only linked to the US administration. You are right in a way, and that's interesting if you try to look at it from the outside, and my husband sometimes asks me, you're always so afraid that you'll be dominated by China. But look at how the Americans order you around. Look at Belgium. The Americans say you're going to buy F-35s, and we sputter a bit and we pretend to protest, but in the end, what do we do? Okay, we buy F-35s. So there is something of it, but I don't want to overstate it. I come back to it. Equidistance between the great powers, and I get this question often, and I think indeed equidistance is probably not the right term. I think we are definitely much closer to the US, and in all likelihood we will remain much closer to the US than to the others, because we are all democracies, the US and the European states. So I definitely am not arguing that we should distance ourselves from the US. I do think that the current US administration is distancing itself from Europe, but they are moving. We are not moving, I think. So I do want to continue to invest in the transatlantic relationship, but at the same time, I think we should look at Russia and certainly at China as normal powers, right? Not a priori identify them as adversaries or enemies because they are different from ourselves, more different from ourselves than the US is. So what I mean is China is a great power. It does what great powers do. It pursues its interest. That can rub off negatively on our interest. Sometimes also those interests coincide, right? The fact that sometimes if China does something, it affects our interests negatively doesn't mean that China is pursuing an anti-European strategy. Or just like we are not pursuing an anti-China strategy, we are pursuing a strategy for Europe. China is pursuing a strategy for China. And what I think that we should be careful at is that we apply different moral judgments to the same actions depending on who undertakes them. If the US does something, it's for world peace and the common good of mankind. China does exactly the same, it's a threat to the world order, they're trying to take over the world, right? We should be a bit careful here. China opens a navy base in Djibouti, outrage. But we have navy bases in Djibouti, everybody's there. So what's the moral or legal argument that you have to say, we can have a base in Djibouti, but you can't? Right? I'm not saying we should encourage them. I mean, not say build some more, please. Right? But when they do it, we should also kind of be a little bit honest. So in my view, we can cooperate with them. So yes, allies and partners are different, right? We have an alliance with the United States with a mutual defense guarantee. We're not quickly going to establish a collective defense guarantee with a non-democracy. I agree with that. But I don't think that we should exclude security cooperation with non-democracies. I would say that if China is willing, we Europeans should engage China in cooperation on military security. There is a small precedent, which is the naval operations in the Western Indian Ocean against piracy, where we coordinate with the Chinese naval presence. I would say that also in Africa, there are shared security interests. China is becoming a security actor in Africa. We're not going to prevent that, but I think we might as well engage with them. But I think we are willing, and I think we have an interest in working with China to make sure that what they do actually promotes the general security interest. I think the problem is that China pretends to be willing, but in reality isn't willing enough to really cooperate militarily with other actors, even though I think that would be in China's interest. My feeling is that China is still adapting to its great power status, because if you're a great power, you don't just make friends, you make a lot of enemies, and you become a target. And China is, I think, not used to that, and that is still developing. So I don't think that if you look sort of worst case scenarios, right, will Europe move into the Chinese or Russian sphere of influence? Will we get one big Eurasia? I don't think that's a possibility. I don't think Russia and China will ever become an alliance either. They are too different, And if you travel to these countries, you notice that they have a partnership of convenience, but they heartily dislike each other, right? Because the Russians can't get used to the fact that they're no longer number one, that China is number one, and the Chinese get very irritated that nonetheless Russia still behave as if it's the big brother, just like in Stalin's time, so to say. And interests are very different, The Russians make a lot of spiel about American and European presence in their near abroad, but actually the one who is really massively ratcheting up their presence in their near abroad is, of course, China. But they're afraid to say that, because they want to signal to us, look, we're working with China now, so we don't need you. But actually, Russia's China strategy has failed, right? There is because China doesn't need Russia. So that partnership will continue, of course, but it will not become much deeper than it is. So in that sense, I don't see sort of a real big Eurasian conglomerate. And if we are smart, we should also be a bit more diplomatically agile and play into some of those differences between Russia and China to try and play them up a bit. Well, two more things on this, though. What is a risk, though, is that if we do not manage to really keep the EU together, that you get a degree of fragmentation. There are now a couple of governments in the EU who think they can safely antagonize everybody else because the Americans have their back. And I think that's a very dangerous game. One, if you continually irritate all your fellow EU member states, why you think that will not have an impact on those same states when they sit in the NATO table? And we should not forget the point of NATO today is not just to defend the territory of its members, it's also to defend democracy on the territory of their members, right? If an EU NATO member would become really an authoritarian state, and some of them are moving in that direction, and if they have a security problem, which democratic government is going to say to its voters that they will put their troops at risk to save a dictatorship in Central Europe? They won't. So they are directly undermining solidarity in the EU and in the alliance. Two, if I were in those countries, I would not put my faith in the United States, because in the end, the US concern is with China and Asia. And even though Europe is important, not necessarily all of Europe is important of that. So it's a big gamble to say, oh, we don't need the other Europeans because the Americans have our back. Let's invite the Americans to build Fort Trump on our territory. I don't know if you ever watch the Western movies, but the guys in the fort, who do they care about? Well, about the guys in the fort. And the Indians who live around the fort, they are in the end expendable. Even those tribes that are allies, but in the end, they are expendable. So if Europe would fragment, I wouldn't be so sure where the US would draw the red line, right? Maybe part of those Central European states are actually considered then expendable, and maybe a certain US president wouldn't mind so much if they would fall under Russia's influence. So that's a dangerous game. All of that said, so I'm definitely not claiming that we should take our distance from the US, but we should become a much more equal partner to the US, because the US is not going to defend our interest, right? So simply saying, okay, let's follow US strategy on China, is the US going to defend our economic interest? Definitely not. Not this president, surely not, but even future presidents, I have my doubts, right? So nobody is going to defend our interest in our place. So we need to invest in the alliance, but we need to get our own act together so that we have a lot more impact in that alliance. Because now, look at what happens in the Huawei file. On the one hand, I agree. This is 5G infrastructure is critical to national security. So I think you should have a national provider. In our case, a European provider. But you should not. But the idea that you should go further and you set out to destroy Huawei. What do we do if then the next Trump says, Mercedes, that's a threat to national security. I forbid any U.S. company to do business with Mercedes, right? It sounds a bit silly, but then what has happening to Huawei is also a bit silly. And let's not forget that the tariffs on cars are already officially motivated by security concerns. So we have to really have a lot more impact in the alliance than we have today. Finally, let me just say a word. The question of national sovereignty. It's sort of an eternal question, of course, and I do not have any answer to it. I know, I can only sort of restate the case, but in a way this is a rearguard action, right? Of course, all EU member states are sovereign countries, but are they capable independently of safeguarding that sovereignty? Absolutely no. Absolutely no. The problem is that we have trapped ourselves. We have still, in many areas, mostly national decision-making, but actually it's no longer the national border that counts. It's the border of the single market that counts, because that's the economic entity that determines your prosperity. And the idea that you can have national decisions on foreign policy and defense policy in today's Europe on the big issues of the day is just silly, Let me give you a final example. In Singapore, the French defense minister was there, and she came accompanied by the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier with the carrier group all the way to Singapore. Now that's of course a very strong signal, right? Wow, Europe is here, right, with a French flag, but still Europe is here. A European carrier group in Singapore. But One, the French have one carrier, right? If you have one carrier, it means you have a carrier for 4 months of the year, because the other 8 months it'll be in refitting. So you can defend your interest for 4 months of the year. Two, even if the French would have 3 carriers and they could have a carrier group in Asia at any moment of the year, but what's the point if there is no collective European strategy behind that? Because a carrier group is an instrument, right, for a strategy. Is France going to have an Asia strategy? No, you can only have a European strategy, because only at the European level can you have the economic and political scale to actually weigh on it. If you act independently, you become vulnerable. Now, that's what the UK is experiencing. Already today, China is threatening the UK to say, after Brexit, you're going to have to stop sending your Navy ships through the South China Sea, or we will punish you economically, right? So this proves that the idea of national sovereignty in Europe is, in my way, totally obsolete. But I know this is very easy for me to say, it's always easy to provoke an audience with it, especially in Paris, and it's very difficult to convince actors of that. Thank you for all those questions.
So thank you very much, Sven, for this presentation, as comprehensive, as detailed it was, and for offering us a very interesting analysis on Europe in the context of the return of great powers, the old and the new, the old and the emergent ones. And I would just remember from the many messages Sven left us, a very important one: cooperate where you can and push back where you must. An excellent way of projecting influence, and that's exactly what Europe should do, and it's trying to do. So thank you once again. You are kindly invited for a coffee outside, and we'll be back at 11:15. Thank you.
Good question, huh?